They mocked him, called it madness, said it was impossible. And it all started with a frozen landscape that no one believed could be used as a weapon. In the winter of 1708, Sweden had the most feared army in Europe. Charles V, the soldier king who had never lost a battle, was marching toward the heart of Russia with 44,000 veterans hardened by years of war. They had crushed the Danes, the Poles, and the Saxons. Nothing seemed able to stop them. On the other side, Peter the Great, ruler of an empire many Europeans still saw as backward and barbaric, faced the dilemma of his life. His forces were numerous, yes, but less trained, less disciplined, less experienced. In a conventional battle on an open plain, the Swedes would grind the Russians down as they had done to everyone else. Then a general proposed something that sounded absurd. He didn't suggest meeting the Swedes on open ground. He didn't propose building unbeatable fortifications. He didn't promise to recruit more soldiers or forge more cannons. He said something that made the room fall silent. "We will not defeat them. We will let them defeat themselves." The other generals looked at him as if he'd gone mad. Let the enemy defeat themselves? Charles V was a tactical genius. His men were war machines. They didn't make mistakes. They didn't break. They didn't run. How exactly would such an army defeat itself? The answer was winter. The cold. The frozen terrain that stretched for thousands of miles between Sweden and Moscow. But not in the way anyone expected. See, when you think of winter as a military obstacle, you think of troops freezing to death, horses losing shoes on the ice, soldiers losing fingers to frostbite. You think of shared suffering. But this general saw something different. He saw that not all armies suffer equally in winter. He saw that a marching army suffers far more than an army that can take shelter. That soldiers attacking across frozen fields suffer far more than soldiers defending in heated towns. That a supply line stretched for thousands of miles through snow and ice is far more vulnerable than a short protected line. The plan wasn't to survive the winter. It was to make the Swedes sink into it. And the generals in the room remained skeptical. Because in their minds, Charles V wouldn't be foolish enough to march deep into Russia in winter. No sensible commander would do that. Napoleon hadn't yet made that mistake, so there was no historical lesson to lean on. But military common sense said you don't invade a continental empire in winter. You wait for spring. You consolidate your victories. You regroup. But Peter the Great knew Charles V better than the other generals. He knew the Swedish king was young, impatient, unshakable in his self-confidence. Charles believed he was invincible, believed his men were superior, and believed that if he could just reach the heart of Russia before Peter organized a proper defense, the war would be over. So yes, Charles would march in winter. Because he didn't see winter as an enemy. He saw it as another obstacle his veterans could overcome through sheer will and discipline. And that was exactly what Peter counted on him thinking. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Retreat. Burn everything. Leave nothing. No granary full of grain. No forage depot for horses. No intact village where troops could shelter. No working mill. No unprotected well. Nothing. The Swedes would advance through a frozen wasteland, where every kilometer gained would leave them weaker, hungrier, more desperate. And the deeper they went, the more impossible retreat would become. But several generals objected. Burn your own villages. Leave your own people homeless in the dead of winter? Surrender territory without a fight? That wasn't just cowardly. It was cruel, inhumane, unthinkable. Peter listened to the objections in silence. Then he spoke, and his words were as cold as the very winter he planned to use as a weapon. Villages can be rebuilt. Empires cannot. And so the plan was approved. But even then, even when the orders were given, most Russian commanders didn't fully believe it would work. How could you be sure Charles would press on? What if he turned back? What if he somehow found a way to live off the land? What if the winter itself wasn't as severe as everyone expected? Those questions hovered over every decision as the autumn of 1708 gave way to winter, and then Charles crossed the border. 44,000 men, the finest soldiers in Europe, equipped with Swedish muskets, sharp sabers, and years of battle experience. They marched in perfect formation. Their flags fluttered in the icy wind. Their drums kept a steady cadence. They looked unstoppable. The first weeks were almost easy. Small skirmishes with Russian rearguards that always fell back before a real fight. Abandoned villages, yes. But there was still some supply left behind, either from haste or incomplete sabotage. The Swedes found barns that hadn't been completely burned, wells that still had water, houses that could still shelter a few men for a night. And Charles read that as Russian weakness. He told his officers that Peter was too afraid to fight, that the Russians were panicking, fleeing so fast they couldn't even properly destroy their own supplies. He saw the burned villages not as deliberate strategy, but as chaotic desperation. That was the first illusion the Russian winter began to weave. Because with each passing week it got harder. Temperatures plummeted. What began as biting cold turned into something much worse. Snow fell so heavy that men marched with it up to their knees. Winds blew so hard men literally couldn't stand. And the cold was unlike anything most Swedes had ever experienced. It wasn't the Scandinavian winter cold, severe but predictable. It was continental cold, steppe cold, a cold that penetrated wool and leather and flesh all the way to the bone. The horses began to die first. Without proper forage, without shelter, without horseshoes suited for ice, they simply collapsed. Some fell while hauling guns. Others fell at night while tethered. At first the Swedes tried to use the meat, but soon there were so many dead horses that even that became impractical. They just left the frozen carcasses behind, grotesque markers along the route of their march. Then came the toes, the fingers, the ears, the noses. Frostbite began to spread through the army like a silent plague. Men woke up in the morning to find they couldn't feel their feet. They tried to put on boots and discovered their toes had gone black overnight. Battlefield surgeons became butchers, sawing off frozen digits without anesthesia because there was no other choice. And the Russians? They never stayed still long enough to be caught. Small bands of Cossack cavalry appeared on the horizon, fired a few arrows, and vanished before the Swedes could respond. Infantry detachments raided supply wagons at night and withdrew before dawn. The Swedish rear was constantly harried, constantly bleeding men, constantly forced to stay alert even when exhausted. But the worst wasn't the attacks. The worst was the nothing. Because as the Swedes pushed deeper into Russian territory, they found less and less. The villages weren't just abandoned, they were systematically destroyed. Barns reduced to ash, wells choked with stones and refuse, bridges burned, roads blocked. Every resource an invading army would normally rely on had been deliberately removed. And Charles kept pushing forward. His officers began to ask questions, polite at first, then more urgent. Shouldn't we wait for spring? Shouldn't we fall back to a town where we can regroup? Shouldn't we at least slow until our supply lines catch up? Charles refused everything. He believed that if he showed weakness, if he hesitated for a moment, the Russians would gain courage. He believed his only chance of victory was to keep the pressure on, to keep advancing, to keep forcing Peter back until there was nowhere left to retreat. But the frozen terrain was doing something no enemy army had managed to do. It was breaking the Swedish war machine piece by piece. By December 1708, the army that had crossed into Russia no longer existed. Not in the sense that it had been destroyed in battle, but in the sense that it had been consumed by the very act of trying to survive. Of the 44,000 men who began the campaign, less than half were still fit for combat. Some had died of cold, some of hunger, some of disease. Some had simply deserted, preferring to risk execution rather than face another day on the frozen march. And yet no major battle had been fought. No epic siege, no decisive clash. Just a slow, inexorable attrition while the winter did the work that Peter had planned for it to do. The frozen ground the generals had mocked was not merely an obstacle. It was the weapon. Every kilometer of frozen steppe the Swedes crossed made them weaker. Every night spent in frozen tents sapped their will to fight. Every missed meal, every dead horse, every amputated finger, every deserter slipping away into the dark. All of it was part of the invisible war machine that Peter had built. It wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was made of cold, hunger, and distance. And as 1709 began, Charles finally began to understand what kind of trap he had walked into. He was too deep in Russia to retreat without admitting total defeat. He was too weak to press straight on to Moscow. His supply lines were stretched to breaking. His men were demoralized. His once invincible army had been reduced to a band of starving, frozen survivors. But what he couldn't see, what none of the Swedes trudging through the snow could yet see, was that the most brutal phase was still to come. Because the frozen terrain hadn't just weakened the Swedish army. It had been perfectly positioned for the final trap. And when that trap closed, the army that had once been feared across Europe would cease to exist entirely. But Peter the Great wasn't done planning. While Charles V pushed deeper into Russian territory, confident in his inevitable victory, Peter had something far more devastating prepared. He knew that Charles wouldn't just get tired, he would get trapped. Every burned village, every destroyed supply depot, every impassable bridge had been placed with surgical precision. The real genius wasn't in the burning and destruction, it was in what came next. Peter had arranged his forces to harass the Swedish army constantly. Small bands of Cossack cavalry would strike the rear, fire arrows into the marching columns, then vanish before Swedish counterattack. Not running in panic, but withdrawing in disciplined fashion. Always in the same direction, always driving Charles deeper into the frozen heartland. Charles read these attacks as desperation. He thought Peter was running scared, unable to stand against Swedish military might. He didn't realize he was being herded like livestock toward a specific objective. And that objective was the Poltava region flat, frozen ground surrounded by defensive positions Peter had carefully selected and reinforced. Peter had positioned his artillery carefully in the forests and along the terrain, concealed and ready to create devastating crossfire. This was sophisticated tactics in the age before modern warfare. In an era when most commanders relied on straightforward battles and open fields, Peter had transformed the very ground itself into a weapon system. Hidden positions, prepared defenses, layered tactical depth that would transform Charles's numerical advantage into a liability. But the true genius wasn't just the terrain, it was the timing. Peter waited until Charles was completely committed, deep in Russia, exhausted, his supply lines shattered, his army weakening by the day. He waited until Charles's confidence had become recklessness, until the Swedish king believed victory was certain. And then winter intensified. Not by accident. Peter had studied the seasonal weather patterns for the region. He knew when the coldest months would arrive. He knew that visibility would drop, that snow would become blinding, that the frozen ground would become treacherous. And he timed his confrontation to exploit every single weather advantage. Imagine the scene from the Swedish perspective. You're marching through a snow-covered region as part of the most feared invasion force in Europe. Suddenly, the blizzard intensifies beyond anything you've experienced. Within hours, you can't see the soldiers marching 3 feet ahead of you. The formation starts to disintegrate because maintaining unit cohesion is impossible when you're navigating blind. And then, you hear it. The sound of Russian war drums in the distance, something unexpected. Something that seems to come from every direction at once. Your mind tries to calculate how many Russian soldiers are out there based on the volume of sound, but the blizzard distorts everything. It could be a few thousand, it could be 10,000. That's when the first artillery barrage hits. The cannon fire rips through the snow at a height that brings down men standing upright. But you can't see where the shots came from. The blizzard swallowed the cannon flashes. The sound echoed off the terrain in such a way that it seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You try to form a defensive line, but from which direction? The frozen ground makes it impossible to entrench. The snow hides holes and rocks that twist ankles and shatter formations. And those damn Russian guns keep firing, always from a slightly different position. Always impossible to locate through the white wall of blizzard that has turned an army of 44,000 into thousands of disorganized, freezing groups. This was environmental warfare at its most devastating. Peter didn't just use the terrain, he weaponized it. The frozen ground Charles had expected to cross easily became a prison. Every misstep on hidden ice shattered formations. Every attempt to retreat met snowdrifts so deep that an organized withdrawal became a panicked rout. And here's where Peter's tactical layering reached its peak. Those cavalry detachments that had harassed the Swedes for weeks, they hadn't been retreating randomly. They had been herding Charles toward pre-prepared defensive positions. Positions carefully chosen by commanders who knew this territory intimately, who understood every ridge, every approach, every way the terrain could be exploited. When the blizzard finally cleared, it revealed not a random encounter, but a death trap. Swedish soldiers scattered across the landscape in disorganized groups. Russian artillery positioned to create devastating crossfire while Russian infantry attacked from prepared positions. And those cavalry units that had seemed to be fleeing, they reappeared on the Swedish flanks and rear, cutting off escape routes, transforming chaos into absolute catastrophe. The battlefield exploded into devastation. Swedish soldiers who had expected an easy victory suddenly found Russian infantry colliding with them head-on, while cavalry attacked their flanks and artillery tore through their ranks. The frozen ground that Charles had dismissed as merely a winter nuisance became a deadly trap. Every attempt to maneuver met hidden ice and snow. Every attempt to form a cohesive defensive line shattered against the terrain Peter had turned into a weapon. And Peter? He didn't fight in the front lines. He orchestrated it. He stood behind the lines, surrounded by messengers carrying orders to different units, adjusting tactics in real time based on reports that arrived constantly. When the Swedish right wing tried to mount a coordinated counterattack, he redirected cavalry units to break their formation before it could solidify. When a Swedish elite regiment nearly broke through toward Russian gun positions, he had reserve forces positioned exactly where they were needed to repel them. This was not battle. It was military choreography in action. Each unit moved in precise coordination, creating overlapping layers of fire and maneuver that left the Swedes no line of retreat, no opportunity to regroup. The first hours of the battle produced more Swedish casualties than entire campaigns had produced in previous wars, and this was only the opening. The terrain the generals had mocked became a force multiplier that amplified every Russian tactical advantage while negating Charles's numerical edge. The frozen ground that should have enabled rapid Swedish advance became a treacherous obstacle. The blizzard that should have been a mere inconvenience became deadly confusion. The defensive positions that should have been easy to breach became unassailable strongpoints. The numerical advantage that had made Charles's invasion seem inevitable was collapsing at a rate that would make military historians debate the records for generations. 37,000 Swedish soldiers, Europe's most disciplined and feared troops, were being systematically destroyed by an equal or smaller Russian force. Not through suicidal bravery or impossible luck, but through careful planning that had turned every environmental element into a tactical advantage. And the most brutal part? The real attrition hadn't peaked yet. What happened in the following hours would reshape military doctrine, create legends that lasted centuries, and prove once and for all that in war, understanding the terrain matters more than raw military power. It's the difference between crushing victory and catastrophic defeat. The generals who had mocked Peter's plan were about to witness something no military academy had prepared them for. Environmental strategy at its most devastating, where the land itself became Russia's deadliest asset. And as the battle raged, the frozen field became a graveyard. The Swedish soldiers, exhausted and disoriented by the blizzard and constant attacks, suddenly found themselves trapped in a carefully orchestrated tactical encirclement, closing in from all sides. Russian infantry rose from behind snow-covered positions, attacking from the front. Cavalry units hammered the flanks, and the Russian artillery, positioned with surgical precision, opened fire from locations that kept shifting, never long enough to be targeted effectively. The Swedes tried to regroup. But how do you reorganize when every move you make has been anticipated? When every attempt to retreat only takes you deeper into the trap? The blizzard, which seemed like just another winter hardship, now revealed its true strategic purpose. Each gust of wind carried commands that were swallowed in the chaos. Each wave of falling snow made it impossible to distinguish Swedish units from the mass of disorganized soldiers. The Swedes were fighting three enemies at once: the Russian forces, the terrain, and the winter itself. And Peter hadn't just planned a defensive battle. He had orchestrated environmental warfare at its most devastating. Every position had been shaped into a killing ground. The Swedes tried to climb the higher terrain to escape the Russian crossfire, but their feet sank into deep snow deliberately left unconsolidated. They tried to retreat the way they came, only to find that route now cut off by obstacles felled strategically, invisible under the snow until too late. They tried to cross frozen streams, and thin ice shattered under their weight, plunging soldiers into water that killed within minutes. It wasn't just a defense. It was tactical geometry applied to the landscape, using nature as force multiplier against brute force. The Swedish artillery, those heavy cannon that should have provided overwhelming firepower, were now rendered useless. Stuck in deep snow, impossible to reposition, they became immobile monuments to poor planning. Swedish gunners tried to fire back, but at what? The Russian forces never stayed still. Russian gun crews fired and immediately shifted position, sliding silently over packed snow while the smoke from the previous shot still hung in the air. It was asymmetric warfare in its most brutal form. An equal or smaller force, but perfectly adapted to the environment, devastating an army trained for conventional open-field tactics. And as the battle reached its climax, the Swedish generals finally understood. That plan they had mocked at the General Council. That frozen strategy they called insane. That General Peter the Great, whose proposal they had dismissed with contempt. He was right, all along. As the blizzard finally cleared, it revealed the full scale of the catastrophe. The frozen ground was covered with Swedish bodies, thousands of them. Some still moved weakly, trying to crawl across blood-stained snow. Most lay still. The frozen streams the Swedes tried to cross were clogged with drowned soldiers, their armor pulling them down beneath broken ice. The higher ground they tried to climb was marked with trails of bodies that had slid back down, too weak to keep going. And across the frozen field, those once magnificent Swedish artillery pieces sat mired and useless, surrounded by their dead gunners, silent testimony to a military doctrine that valued brute force over tactical adaptation. The battle was over, but the casualty figures that emerged would shock all of Europe. 27,000 Swedish casualties, not spread across a campaign, not distributed through multiple battles. In a single engagement, on a single frozen field, over a single winter day. And the connection to Peter's tactical decisions was crystal clear. That prepared ground turned soldiers into trapped targets. Those Russian gun crews methodically eliminated thousands before the Swedes could effectively respond. That perfectly timed blizzard plunged an entire army into lethal confusion. That strategic positioning on the frozen terrain magnified every Russian advantage. Every environmental element that Peter had calculated into the plan contributed directly to that devastating casualty differential of 27,000 lives. The generals who had mocked him, who had called his frozen strategy impossible, now faced the magnitude of their error. They had gambled on conventional doctrine against environmental reality. and it cost them a generation of soldiers. Some of those generals never recovered from the shame. Historical records show several resigned after the battle, unable to accept that they had rejected the plan that could have won a quick, decisive victory. Others spent their remaining years trying to explain how they hadn't seen what Peter saw so clearly. But the truth was simple and brutal. They looked at that frozen terrain and saw only obstacles. Peter looked at the same landscape and saw a weapon, and that difference in perspective determined the fate of 27,000 men. Peter the Great, the reformer who walked into that war room with a proposal everyone else called madness, was now recognized as one of history's great military strategists. But to him, it wasn't genius. It was simply a deep understanding of how environmental advantage could be turned into strategic victory. The frozen plan wasn't brilliant, he would later reflect. They simply failed to understand that in war, the land itself can become your greatest ally. The Battle of Poltava was more than just a military victory. It was a harsh lesson in the dangers of conventional thinking. It proved that rejected innovation can matter more than accepted doctrine. It showed that adapting to environmental conditions beats trying to dominate through sheer force. And it became a case study that military strategists still analyze today, more than 3 centuries later. Today, in military academies worldwide, the Battle of Poltava is taught as a watershed moment in strategic thinking. Not just as clever terrain usage, but as a lesson in the institutional cost of dismissing unconventional ideas. Instructors point to those 27,000 casualties and ask a simple question. If you'd been in that war council when Peter presented his plan, would you have mocked him? Or would you have recognized the brilliance of what he was proposing? It's an uncomfortable question, because the honest truth is that most of us, faced with such a radical strategy, would probably have reacted exactly like those generals, relying on past experience, on conventional military doctrine, on tactics proven by centuries of warfare. And that's the deepest lesson from Poltava. Institutional experience has real value. What's worked in the past matters. But when environmental conditions shift, when circumstances create new opportunities, clinging stubbornly to outdated methods can be catastrophic. The Swedish army paid for that rigidity with thousands of lives. The generals who rejected Peter paid with their careers and reputations. Peter himself, the reformer whose plan was dismissed with contempt, was vindicated completely. Not because he sought glory, not because he wanted to prove how superior his thinking was, but because he understood something fundamental that others missed. In warfare, the environment isn't just a setting, it's an active force, and those who learn to work with it rather than against it gain an advantage that raw military power alone can never match. They dismissed it. They called it frozen madness, and it cost them 27,000 soldiers. So, which moment of this strategy struck you most powerfully? Was it how the terrain itself became a killing zone? The tactical positioning of forces across impossible landscape? Or the way Peter timed the blizzard to create maximum chaos? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious which aspect of this strategy resonates with you. And if this story of a dismissed plan that changed everything fascinated you, you'll absolutely want to explore other cases where rejected strategies became legendary victories. Discover more unlikely victories where unconventional thinking triumphed over conventional wisdom. Subscribe so you don't miss these incredible historical lessons. Because history keeps teaching us that innovation matters, that unconventional perspectives can outmaneuver established thinking, that when you truly understand your environment, it becomes your greatest advantage. And sometimes, the people everyone dismisses as crazy, they're actually visionaries, just waiting for the world to catch up.